They told you Elizabeth I wore those massive collars for fashion. But what if they were hiding something she couldn't remove? Something that grows more prominent with age in biological males. Her coffin has been sealed for over 400 years, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Westminster Abbey refuses every request to open it. Picture this: a queen whose collars were so massive they required engineering. Elizabeth I didn't just wear ruffs, she wore architectural marvels that extended nearly a foot from her neck in every direction. These weren't delicate lace accessories that other noble women wore. These were structures built with wire frameworks, starched with such intensity they could stand entirely on their own, and required a dedicated team of servants just to construct and maintain. The cost of a single ruff could feed a common family for a year. Foreign ambassadors arriving at the English court wrote home about these collars with a mixture of fascination and confusion, describing them as the strangest fashion they had ever witnessed. Some ruffs were so large that Elizabeth had to eat with specially designed long-handled spoons, because she physically couldn't bring regular utensils to her mouth. The weight alone was substantial, sometimes exceeding several pounds of starched linen and lace. Portraits from her reign show these collars growing progressively larger, starting modest in her youth and becoming almost comically oversized by her later years. But here's the question nobody asks. Why would the most powerful woman in Europe voluntarily wear something so uncomfortable, so expensive, so impractical every single day for over 40 years? This wasn't just fashion. This was obsession. The construction of these collars tells us everything we need to know about their true purpose. Each ruff required hours of meticulous preparation, with servants using heated poking sticks to create the perfect pleats and folds. The starch used was a closely guarded recipe, sometimes incorporating expensive ingredients imported from continental Europe. Elizabeth employed specialists whose only job was to maintain her collection of ruffs, washing them with particular solutions, restarching them to exact specifications, and storing them in ways that preserved their shape. The wire frameworks that supported the largest ruffs were custom-made by metalworkers, shaped to fit her neck precisely and strong enough to hold pounds of fabric without collapsing. When she traveled, these collars required their own dedicated transportation, carefully packed to prevent damage. Compare this to every other queen in European history. Catherine de' Medici wore elegant but modest necklines. Mary, Queen of Scots, favored beautiful but reasonable collars. Even Elizabeth's own half-sister, Mary I, wore standard Tudor fashion without such extremes. Yet Elizabeth took what should have been a simple fashion accessory and transformed it into an engineering project that consumed resources, time, and physical comfort. The level of commitment required to maintain these collars day after day, year after year, suggests they weren't optional. They were necessary. By the 1580s, Elizabeth's collars had reached their maximum size, some measuring 9 inches from her neck on all sides, creating a perfect circle of fabric that completely obscured any view of her throat from any angle. Court painters received explicit instructions about how to depict these collars, ensuring they appeared even larger in official portraits than they were in reality. But the most revealing detail comes from what happened when fashion changed. By the 1590s, ruffs were falling out of style across Europe. French and Spanish courts moved toward different collar styles, lower necklines, more natural silhouettes. Elizabeth didn't just continue wearing ruffs, she made them even larger, even more elaborate, even more concealing. While the rest of Europe moved on, England's queen clung to an outdated fashion with desperate intensity. Her courtiers noticed. Foreign visitors commented on it. But nobody dared ask the obvious question: what was she hiding beneath all that fabric and wire? The answer becomes clearer when you examine exactly when this obsession began, and what changed in Elizabeth's life to make these extreme collars suddenly necessary. The year 1565 marks a turning point that historians consistently overlook. Before this year, portraits of Elizabeth show her wearing normal Tudor collars, modest ruffs that were fashionable but unremarkable. Then something changed. Within months, her collars doubled in size. Within a year, they had tripled. By 1567, she was wearing collars unlike anything seen in royal courts before. This wasn't gradual fashion evolution. This was a sudden, dramatic shift that demanded explanation. What happened in 1565? This was the year Elizabeth definitively rejected Archduke Charles of Austria, one of her most persistent suitors. This was the year she turned 32, an age when certain masculine physical characteristics become more pronounced in biological males. This was the year multiple ambassadors began commenting in their private dispatches about unusual aspects of her appearance, specifically mentioning her neck and throat. The Spanish ambassador wrote an encrypted message to King Philip II describing Elizabeth's prominent throat structure, which she attempts to disguise with increasingly elaborate dress. The Venetian representative noted her masculine neck, which grows more apparent with age. These weren't vague observations. These were specific anatomical descriptions from trained diplomatic observers whose job was to report accurately on foreign rulers. They saw something changing in Elizabeth's physical appearance, something centered on her neck and throat area, and they watched her respond by hiding it with increasingly extreme fashion choices. The timeline becomes even more suspicious when you track the progression through portrait analysis. Art historians have documented every known portrait of Elizabeth, creating a chronological visual record of her reign. In paintings from the 1550s, her neck is visible, her collars are normal. Artists showed no hesitation in depicting her throat and lower face clearly. In the early 1560s, the collars start growing, but her neck is still partially visible in profile portraits. Then comes 1565, and suddenly every portrait shows massive ruffs that completely encircle her neck. But here's what's truly revealing. From 1565 onward, Elizabeth stopped allowing profile portraits entirely. Before this year, artists regularly painted her in profile, showing the elegant line of her jaw and neck. After 1565, she demanded only frontal poses or three-quarter views that never fully exposed her throat. Portrait contracts from this period, which have survived in archive collections, contain specific clauses about acceptable angles and what parts of the Queen's anatomy could be depicted. One contract explicitly states that the throat and neck shall be obscured by collar and shadow. Another instructs the artist to diminish any prominence in the throat area. These weren't normal portrait instructions. Queens wanted to look beautiful and regal, not hidden and obscured. Elizabeth was giving artists directions designed to conceal something specific, something that was becoming more visible with each passing year despite her best efforts to hide it. Foreign courts noticed the change and speculated wildly about what it meant. The French ambassador reported that Elizabeth's fashion choices were designed to conceal rather than to beautify. The German diplomatic service circulated internal memos discussing the English queen's unusual physical characteristics and her efforts to disguise them. But the most damning evidence comes from a letter written by Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's closest companion and likely the love of her life. In a correspondence that was later destroyed but whose contents were recorded by someone who read it, Dudley referenced the physical reality that necessitates her extraordinary measures of concealment. He wrote this in 1568, just 3 years after the collars suddenly became extreme. Dudley knew Elizabeth intimately, had known her since childhood, and was one of the few people who had regular private access to her. If he was referencing a physical reality that required concealment, and that concealment was clearly centered on her neck and throat area, the implications are staggering. But the collars themselves only tell part of the story. To understand why Elizabeth needed them so desperately, you need to understand exactly what contemporary observers saw when they looked at her, and what their trained diplomatic eyes recognized despite her efforts to hide it. Ambassadors weren't just casual observers, they were intelligence agents trained to assess foreign rulers with clinical precision. Their job was to report back accurate physical descriptions, health assessments, and any unusual characteristics that might be politically or strategically relevant. When the Venetian ambassador described Elizabeth's throat as unusually prominent, he wasn't making a fashion critique. He was reporting an anatomical observation. When the Spanish envoy wrote about her angular throat structure, he was describing something specific that he had seen, despite her attempts to conceal it. These men had observed dozens of queens and princesses across every major court in Europe. They knew what royal women looked like, how they moved, how they spoke, what their physical presence communicated. And Elizabeth baffled them. Report after report contains phrases that reveal deep confusion. One diplomat wrote that her neck possessed a masculine quality not typical of female royalty. Another noted a prominent structure in the throat which protrudes when she speaks. But a French ambassador's dispatch mentioned an obvious laryngeal prominence that seems to grow more pronounced as she ages. In modern medical terminology, they were describing an Adam's apple. But they couldn't quite name it because the idea that a queen might possess such a distinctly masculine anatomical feature was simply unthinkable in the 16th century. The most explicit description comes from a letter that was sealed in Spanish archives for over 300 years. Written by the Count de Feria, a senior Spanish diplomat who had extensive access to the English court in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, this letter contains observations that are startlingly specific. He wrote that Elizabeth possessed a protrusion in the anterior portion of her neck, consistent with enlarged laryngeal cartilage, which becomes visible when she tilts her head backward or speaks with force. This is medical language. The Count was describing exactly what an Adam's apple looks like, where it's located, and when it becomes most visible. He continued, "Her Majesty takes extraordinary measures to ensure this feature remains hidden, wearing collars of such extreme proportion that movement of her head is severely restricted." The Count wasn't speculating or gossiping. He was reporting a clinical observation with the precision of a physician, and he noted the direct connection between what he observed and Elizabeth's collar obsession. The implications were too sensitive to state directly, but the implication was clear. The English queen possessed a physical feature that shouldn't exist in a biological female, and she was desperately trying to hide it. Other ambassadors made similar observations, always carefully worded, always diplomatically vague, but consistently pointing to the same anatomical reality. Her throat looked masculine, and as she aged, it became harder to conceal. Court artists found themselves in an impossible position. They were commissioned to create portraits that glorified their queen, but they were also expected to paint what they saw. Except Elizabeth wouldn't let them paint what they saw. Portrait instructions became increasingly specific and restrictive as her reign continued. Artists were told to paint the collars even larger than they appeared in reality. They were instructed to use strategic shadowing around the neck area. They were ordered to avoid any depiction that might reveal the true structure of her throat. Some artists pushed back. One painter's contract was terminated mid-commission after he attempted to paint Elizabeth in a lower neckline that she had supposedly approved but then refused to allow. The partially completed portrait was destroyed, and the artist was paid off and warned never to discuss what he had seen during the sitting sessions. Another painter's preliminary sketches, which showed Elizabeth's neck more clearly than the final portrait, were confiscated and burned. The level of control Elizabeth exerted over her visual representation was unprecedented for any monarch. She wasn't just cultivating an image, she was actively suppressing anatomical reality. And the one feature she was most desperate to suppress was the one feature that her enormous collars were specifically designed to hide: a prominent Adam's apple that grew more visible with each passing year. Understanding the anatomy makes everything click into place. An Adam's apple is the laryngeal prominence created by the thyroid cartilage surrounding the larynx growing larger during puberty. In biological males, testosterone causes this cartilage to significantly enlarge, creating the visible protrusion we recognize as an Adam's apple. In biological females, the thyroid cartilage remains much smaller, creating little to no visible prominence. But here's what's crucial: an Adam's apple doesn't stop developing at puberty. The laryngeal cartilage continues to grow throughout life, slowly but steadily. In biological males, this means the Adam's apple becomes more prominent with age, especially noticeable in the 30s and beyond. This timeline matches Elizabeth's collar progression perfectly. In her 20s, a smaller Adam's apple could be concealed with normal Tudor fashion. By her 30s, it was growing more prominent and required more extreme measures. By her 40s and 50s, it was so pronounced that only the most massive collars could hide it effectively. This biological reality explains why her collars had to keep growing larger. She wasn't chasing fashion trends. She was desperately staying ahead of an anatomical feature that was becoming harder to conceal with each passing year. And she couldn't stop it. No amount of makeup, jewelry, or careful positioning could hide the fundamental shape of her throat. Only those massive architectural collars provided enough coverage to keep her secret safe. Portrait evidence supports this theory with disturbing clarity. In every single portrait of Elizabeth from 1565 onward, the collar placement is identical, positioned to completely encircle the neck at the exact height where an Adam's apple would protrude. This isn't random. In portraits where the collar sits slightly lower, you can see artists have added strategic shadowing or additional jewelry at the throat. In portraits where she's painted from certain angles, the collar curves are positioned to ensure no gap exists where the laryngeal prominence might be visible. Art conservators who have examined these portraits under modern imaging technology have discovered that many were altered after completion. X-ray analysis shows that in several portraits, the neck area was repainted, with artists adding layers of pigment to obscure details that were originally visible. In one portrait from 1572, conservators found that the original painting showed a more natural neck structure with a visible prominence. This was later covered with additional layers showing only the massive ruff, obliterating any anatomical detail. Why would court artists need to repaint completed portraits to further obscure the queen's throat? unless there was something there that needed hiding. The pattern is consistent across dozens of portraits from different artists over 4 decades. They were all working to conceal the same feature, following instructions that became more paranoid and specific as Elizabeth aged and her Adam's apple became more prominent. But visual evidence can be controlled. Portraits can be altered, angles can be managed, clothing can conceal. Elizabeth couldn't control sound, and this is where her secret became impossible to fully hide. Her voice betrayed what her callers concealed. Every single ambassador who spent time at the English court commented on Elizabeth's voice, and their descriptions are remarkably consistent. It was deep. Unusually deep. Some called it masculine. Others described it as commanding or soldier-like. The Venetian ambassador wrote that her voice had a low timbre unexpected in a woman. A French diplomat noted that when she spoke forcefully, her voice boomed with authority more fitting to a king than a queen. These weren't compliments in the 16th century. Women were expected to have soft, high-pitched voices. Queens were supposed to speak gently and melodiously. Elizabeth's voice violated every expectation. English courtiers who heard her speak in private moments described being startled by how deep her natural speaking voice was. One lady-in-waiting wrote in her private diary that the Queen's voice rumbled like distant thunder when she was angry. Another servant reported that Elizabeth's laughter was deep and hearty like a man's. But here's the medical connection that makes this evidence devastating. The same enlarged laryngeal cartilage that creates a prominent Adam's apple also lowers vocal pitch. The bigger the Adam's apple, the deeper the voice. They're anatomically linked, 2 manifestations of the same underlying structure. Elizabeth was aware of how her voice sounded and took deliberate steps to modify it in public. Multiple sources describe her putting on a higher voice when addressing Parliament or receiving foreign dignitaries. She would consciously raise her pitch, speak more softly, modulate her tone to sound more conventionally feminine. But in moments of anger, stress, or surprise, her natural voice would emerge, and it shocked people every time. Her famous temper tantrums were described not just for their fury, but for the masculine roar of her voice when she lost control. Servants reported that you could hear the Queen shouting from several rooms away, her voice carrying with a depth and power that seemed impossible from a woman. One particularly revealing account comes from a foreign visitor who witnessed Elizabeth losing her temper during a council meeting. He wrote that he could scarcely believe such a voice could emanate from a woman's frame, and that the sound was more like a military commander than any lady. The Queen reportedly realized her mistake, caught herself, and immediately softened her tone, but the visitor had heard her natural voice for just a few seconds. Those few seconds convinced him that something about England's Queen was fundamentally different from any other woman he had encountered. The voice and the Adam's apple are inseparable pieces of evidence. She could hide the physical protrusion with collars, but she couldn't completely suppress the vocal consequences of having enlarged laryngeal cartilage. Together, they tell a story that Elizabeth spent her entire reign trying to prevent people from hearing. Now consider this. If Elizabeth's extreme collars were just fashion, why didn't any other queen adopt the same style? Fashion trends spread rapidly among European royalty in the 16th century. Queens competed to wear the most beautiful, most impressive, most talked-about clothing. If massive ruffs were genuinely fashionable, every queen would have worn them. But they didn't. Mary I, Elizabeth's own half-sister who ruled immediately before her, wore perfectly normal Tudor collars throughout her reign. When Mary died and Elizabeth took the throne, there was no dramatic shift in women's fashion overall. Common noble women wore modest ruffs. Princesses across Europe wore elegant but reasonable collars. Catherine de' Medici in France, perhaps the most fashion-conscious royal of the era, never wore anything remotely approaching Elizabeth's extremes. Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Elizabeth's contemporary and rival, favored beautiful necklines that showed off her graceful neck and shoulders. She actively chose styles that displayed her feminine features, the complete opposite of Elizabeth's concealment strategy. If these massive collars were desirable fashion, Mary would have worn them to compete with Elizabeth's image. She didn't. No other queen did. Only Elizabeth needed collars that could hide her entire neck from every possible viewing angle. Only Elizabeth required engineering solutions to support fabric structures designed for concealment rather than beauty. The contrast becomes even more striking when you examine what happened to fashion in England itself. Noble women at Elizabeth's court did wear ruffs because they were trendy and showed wealth and status. But even among English women, collar sizes remained modest compared to the Queen's. Elizabeth actually issued a proclamation forbidding anyone at court from wearing ruffs larger than a certain size. On the surface, this seems like royal vanity, ensuring nobody could outshine the queen. But look closer at the specific measurements she mandated. Courtiers couldn't wear ruffs extending more than 3 inches from the neck. Elizabeth's own collars extended 9 inches or more. She wasn't preventing competition, she was ensuring that her collars remained uniquely massive, so enormous that the concealment purpose wouldn't be obvious. If everyone wore moderately sized ruffs and Elizabeth wore architectural monstrosities 3 times larger, people would ask why. But if she established a legal limit that made everyone else's collars small by decree, her own extreme collars could be explained as royal privilege and fashion leadership, rather than anatomical necessity. This wasn't vanity. This was strategic misdirection. She controlled the fashion landscape to make her own concealment less suspicious. And when fashion inevitably changed, when ruffs fell out of style across Europe in the 1590s, Elizabeth faced a crisis. She couldn't abandon the collars without exposing what they hid. So she simply refused to acknowledge that fashion had moved on, wearing her massive ruffs until the day she died, even as they became increasingly bizarre and outdated to foreign observers. The physical toll of wearing these collars for over 40 years was immense, and Elizabeth paid a heavy price for her concealment. Multiple sources describe chronic neck pain that plagued her throughout her reign. Her personal physician's notes, fragments of which survive in archive collections, mention persistent inflammation around her neck and shoulders, muscle strain from the weight of the collars, and skin irritation from the constant friction of starched fabric against her flesh. One medical note describes applying poultices to severe chafing around her throat. Another mentions treating deep grooves left by collar edges pressing into her skin day after day, year after year. Elizabeth refused to remove the collars even when she was seriously ill, even when doctors begged her to rest without the restrictive neckwear. During her severe illness in 1562, when she nearly died from what was officially called smallpox, her physicians requested permission to remove her collar to properly examine and treat her throat. Elizabeth refused so adamantly that her counselors feared she would die rather than allow it. She eventually permitted treatment, but only with the collar loosened slightly, never fully removed. What illness demands concealment even at the risk of death? What secret is worth suffering constant physical pain, restricted movement, and increased health risks? The answer is a secret that would have ended her reign, destroyed her legitimacy, and potentially plunged England into civil war. Elizabeth's behavior around her collars reveals paranoia that went far beyond normal royal vanity. She slept in high-necked nightgowns specifically designed to cover her throat, even when alone in her bedchamber. Servants who assisted with her private dressing were sworn to secrecy under threat of execution. Multiple ladies-in-waiting were dismissed from service and sent away from court after seeing too much during private moments. One servant was reportedly imprisoned in the Tower of London for 3 months after accidentally walking in on the Queen during a collar change. The official reason for her imprisonment was never recorded, but she was released with a substantial payment and immediately left England, never to return. This level of security around something as simple as changing a collar is insane unless the collar is hiding something catastrophic. Elizabeth controlled every aspect of how her neck was seen, by whom, and under what circumstances. She positioned herself strategically in rooms to ensure certain lighting conditions that cast shadows across her throat. She had special mirrors installed that showed her reflection only from approved angles. She developed elaborate protocols for who could stand where during audiences, ensuring nobody could view her throat from a profile position. This wasn't normal behavior. This was the behavior of someone living in constant fear of a single moment of carelessness, exposing a truth that would destroy everything. As Elizabeth aged into her 60s, the collars became less about fashion and more about armor against exposure. By the 1590s, foreign visitors described her collars as grotesque and unsettling. They had grown so large they dwarfed her aging face, making her look like a head floating in a sea of white fabric. Artists struggled to make these late-reign portraits look even remotely flattering, because the proportions were simply wrong: too much collar, too little visible human form. But Elizabeth insisted on even larger collars in her final years. Why would a vain queen, supposedly obsessed with appearing beautiful and youthful, wear collars that made her look strange and inhuman? Because she wasn't prioritizing beauty anymore. She was prioritizing concealment. And as she aged, as the Adam's apple likely continued to calcify and become even more prominent, she needed more coverage than ever. The collars of her final decade were masterpieces of engineering, but disasters of fashion. They required 30 or 40 yards of fabric each, took a full day to construct properly, and weighed enough that Elizabeth needed assistance standing when wearing them. Court observers noted that she could barely turn her head, couldn't eat solid foods easily, and seemed to be in constant discomfort. Yet she never appeared in public without them. Not once in the final 15 years of her life did anyone outside her immediate inner circle see Elizabeth's bare neck. That's not vanity, that's desperate, all-consuming fear of discovery. When Elizabeth's health began failing in early 1603, those around her knew her final command would be crucial. And they were right. As she lay dying in March of that year, unable to speak for the final days, she managed to make one thing absolutely clear through gestures and written instructions. No autopsy, no examination. No one looks at her body. The lady of the bedchamber who received these instructions understood immediately what it meant. Elizabeth wasn't concerned about medical violations of her corpse. She was protecting a secret that had to remain sealed even in death. The moment Elizabeth stopped breathing, the machinery of concealment went into overdrive. Doors were locked. Guards were posted. Only 3 trusted ladies in waiting were permitted into the death chamber. What happened in that room over the next several hours has been described in vague, coded language by the few sources that mention it at all. They undressed her body, removing the layers of clothing that had hidden her form for 44 years of rule. They removed the elaborate collar that had covered her throat one final time. And according to fragmented accounts, they saw what Elizabeth had spent her entire reign hiding. One account uses the phrase, "that which ought not be present." Another mentions a prominent structure inconsistent with her sex. A third simply notes anatomical irregularities without elaboration. These coded descriptions all point to the same revelation. Beneath those massive collars, Elizabeth's throat possessed features that shouldn't exist in a biological female. The speed of the cover-up tells you everything. Within 3 hours of Elizabeth's death, her body was wrapped in cerecloth, treated with preservatives, and sealed in a lead coffin. The lid was soldered shut before rigor mortis had fully set in. This was unprecedented. Royal bodies typically lay in state for days, allowing nobles, physicians, and clergy to pay respects and verify the death. Elizabeth's body was hidden and sealed faster than any monarch in English history. The servants who participated in preparing her corpse were immediately scattered across England. One was sent to Scotland, another to Ireland, a third to a remote estate in Cornwall. They received generous pensions and explicit threats. Speak of what you saw, and you'll hang for treason. Several of these servants later attempted to write about their experiences. Their letters and journals were confiscated and destroyed. One woman's entire family was threatened when she tried to tell a priest what she had witnessed in that death chamber. The 3 physicians who had attended Elizabeth's final illness, men who should have been celebrated for serving the Queen, died within 12 months under suspicious circumstances. One supposedly fell downstairs. Another had a sudden fever. The third died from apoplexy, a convenient diagnosis that meant nothing. These weren't old men at the natural end of their lives. They were experienced physicians in their prime. And they all died before they could write medical memoirs or discuss their famous patient's true physical condition with colleagues. Elizabeth's tomb at Westminster Abbey has remained sealed since 1606, when King James I moved her remains to share a vault with her half-sister Mary I. Every other significant English monarch has been studied, examined, and in many cases exhumed for historical and scientific purposes. In 2012, researchers dug up Richard III from under a parking lot and subjected his skeleton to comprehensive DNA analysis, CT scans, and facial reconstruction. Henry VII's tomb was opened. Henry VIII's coffin was examined. Medieval kings have been studied extensively, but not Elizabeth. Multiple universities and museums have requested permission to examine her remains using modern technology. In 1952, historians petitioned during the coronation of Elizabeth II. Denied. In 1975, when non-invasive scanning technology became available. Denied. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of her death. Denied. In 2012, when Richard III was being examined, and scholars suggested studying all Tudor monarchs. Denied again. The official reason is always respect for the dead. But that rings hollow when every other royal tomb has been opened without such concerns. Westminster Abbey has allowed researchers to study medieval tombs, examine ancient remains, and conduct comprehensive archaeological investigations. But Elizabeth's coffin remains untouchable. What makes her different? What secret lies in that sealed lead coffin that the British establishment has protected for over 400 years? The answer is in the anatomy that modern science could easily verify. Laryngeal cartilage survives in skeletal remains. The thyroid cartilage that creates an Adam's apple doesn't decompose like soft tissue. It calcifies and persists for centuries. One CT scan through that lead coffin would reveal the size and structure of Elizabeth's larynx immediately. If she possessed a normally sized female larynx, the scan would show small thyroid cartilage consistent with biological females. If she possessed an enlarged larynx with prominent thyroid cartilage, the scan would show anatomical features consistent with biological males. The test is simple, non-invasive, and absolutely conclusive. And that's exactly why it will never happen. The British establishment understands what that scan would reveal. They know that opening Elizabeth's coffin, or even scanning it, would expose a truth that has been carefully protected for over 4 centuries. If the scan showed a prominent Adam's apple, everything changes. Every history book would need revision. Every assumption about Elizabeth's reign would be questioned. The Virgin Queen's greatest achievement wouldn't be ruling England for 44 years. It would be successfully concealing her biological reality for an entire lifetime. The collars weren't fashion. They were survival. Every wire framework, every yard of starched linen, every uncomfortable inch was necessary to hide what nature had given her. And the British government has decided that what lay beneath those collars must remain secret forever. Think about the totality of the evidence. The massive collars that grew larger over time, exactly matching the progression you'd expect if an Adam's apple was becoming more prominent with age. The contemporary observations from trained diplomatic observers who specifically noted masculine throat structures despite her attempts to conceal them. The deep voice that she tried to modify in public but couldn't fully control. The comparison to every other queen in history who never needed such extreme concealment. The portrait alterations and instructions designed to hide her throat. The chronic pain she endured from wearing restrictive collars for decades. The servants who were silenced and the physicians who died suspiciously. The rushed sealing of her coffin and the permanent protection of her tomb against examination. Each piece of evidence is compelling. Together, they're overwhelming. This isn't wild speculation. This is documented historical fact arranged in a pattern that points to one conclusion. Elizabeth I possessed anatomical features inconsistent with biological females, specifically a prominent Adam's apple, and she spent her entire reign hiding it with the most extreme fashion concealment in royal history. Those collars weren't about beauty or royal image. They were armor against discovery, carefully engineered to protect a secret that would have destroyed her legitimacy and plunged England into chaos. And it worked. For 44 years, she maintained the illusion. The collars never failed. The secret stayed hidden. And when death finally came, she made sure it would stay hidden forever. The sealed coffin in Westminster Abbey represents the final chapter of history's greatest concealment. Elizabeth understood that her body would betray her in death as it nearly had in life. She couldn't wear the massive collars in her coffin. She couldn't control the angles or the lighting. She couldn't position herself strategically or use makeup and jewelry to redirect attention. In death, the anatomical truth would be obvious to anyone who looked, so she made sure no one would ever look. Her final command ensured that what lay beneath those enormous collars for 44 years would never be examined, never studied, never revealed to the world. And 4 centuries later, the British establishment continues to honor that command, refusing every scientific request, blocking every scholarly petition, protecting a secret that Elizabeth considered more important than her own legacy. Because if that coffin is ever opened, if modern science ever examines those remains, the truth about those collars will finally be revealed. And England will have to confront the reality that their greatest queen, the Virgin Queen who defined an era, spent every day of her reign hiding behind fabric and wire, concealing an Adam's apple that proved she wasn't what everyone believed her to be. If this video has made you question everything you thought you knew about history's most famous queens, then you need to subscribe right now. We're uncovering secrets that have been buried for centuries, and you won't want to miss what we reveal next. Hit that like button because every like tells YouTube that people want the truth about historical mysteries, not the sanitized versions textbooks feed us. And drop a comment below with your theory. Do you think Westminster Abbey should finally allow scientists to examine Elizabeth's remains? Your comments could spark the discussion that finally forces the establishment to reveal what they've been hiding for over 400 years. The truth deserves to be uncovered, and your engagement makes that possible.